All right, Fast Cat Nation. This is Coach Ricky. I'm going to take over for the big cat today, and I'll try to do my best Ben Delaney impression here, but I'm here with Coach Andrew. What's up?
What's up, Coach Ricky? How you doing, man?
I'm good. Andrew and I, we go way back. Pretty much started racing together way back in the Midwest Tour of America's Dairyland days. And I think, the one thing that we faced in that race was the extreme Midwest humid heat. And I think it's appropriate that today we are going to talk about heat acclimation. What is heat acclimation? Why does it matter? What's happening to the body when it's hot? What are the adaptations that occur and the performance benefits that we can expect? We're going to go over some methods for acclimation and then kind of some more practical recommendations if, you don't want to buy all the highest tech and, stuff that's worked for us in the past. So, but before we get into that, let's do a few announcements and the old rider of the week. This rider of the week comes from Crispin, that's a cool name, Hartung from Boise, Idaho, who is training for a big ride in the Alps and Pyrenees. They said, I just want to say I love your app. Finally, someone is starting to take advantage of AI to provide really useful insights by combining multiple health metrics, training stress, sleep, HRV, all with my ride data. I've been waiting for this, and I can't wait to see how the app and AI evolves. Well, that makes two of us, Crispin. Thank you. We also are pretty excited about the future of the app and AI and how it can make you faster. And announcements, listeners, you can now use CoachCat in the FastCat app for free for the first month. No credit card. You don't have to worry about the sneaky charge that some apps do. No credit card required, and just head over to fastcatcoaching.com. So, Andrew, what do you got? What do you got on the plate? What's coming up?
Yeah, well, I just wrapped up a very hot Tulsa Tough and a very hot Armed Force Classic. So my heat acclimation is already underway, and that's good because this weekend I'm racing BWR Asheville in the
Nice.
in the waffle distance, which is it. It's probably actually going to be the longest ride I've ever done, which is maybe not a good sign for me, but um, it's going to be hot, and I'm going to be ready for that at least. So
How long
um,
is it?
it is 116 miles and
Ooh,
11,000 feet of climbing in a very hot and humid environment. Um,
okay.
what about you, Ricky? What do you got coming up?
Um, well, I actually had a very rare hot tour de Beauce in Quebec, and it's the kind of thing where you don't know it's that hot until you get done with it, and you're just like it's salt heaven on your jersey. I know some people call it the salt Rorschach, where you can decipher images out of it, but I was super hot, super salty, and in all honesty, I don't really have that much heat acclimation. But the big one that I have coming up next month is the Volta Portugal, and
Whoa.
apparently I have never done it. It's a 12-day stage race on the road, and apparently it is so hot. Apparently they have fire trucks at the end of each day that just spray the riders down with water. So I'm a little scared by that, but also I think this is a good one to talk about because yeah, maybe I can even learn something from you today.
Maybe,
So yeah,
maybe.
man, let's hop into it. We're talking heat. It's summer in across most of the United States, most of Europe. I mean, I think Australia is like always hot. Like it's getting hot. There's different types of heat. Some people live in that dry Colorado, Boulder mountain heat. Some people like Andrew are in that North Carolina sticky, wet, humid heat. Yeah, I mean, Andrew, tell me a little bit about it. Like, what's happening out there? It's hot.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I just want to kind of continue with what you're saying and point out that it, and I'm sure everyone's experienced this, all of our listeners out there, it feels like it's getting hotter. Like it's hotter earlier
Yeah,
in the year, which means that we're doing more hot races than we used to. And so I looked this up to just sort of be objective about it. And the NCEI Global Annual Temperature Ranking Outlook
My
explained,
favorite journal, actually.
Ricky's favorite journal, said that there is a 61% chance that 2024 will rank amongst the warmest years on record, and a 100% chance that it will rank in the top 5 warmest years on record. So,
Jeez.
I guess my conclusion is that it's hotter than it used to be, and I think being adapted to the heat through heat acclimation um, is going to become like an increasingly important factor in performance. And so, to give a basic definition of what is heat acclimation or acclimatization, we can use those terms interchangeably here, occurs with repeated exposure to heat, inducing adaptations that enhance thermoregulatory mechanisms and heat tolerance, leading to improved exercise performance in warm to hot conditions. So, what does
So
that
it's
mean?
like, yeah, it's like, maybe for like the lay person like myself, it's like it's almost like, acclimating to altitude or something, we're making changes in the body, right?
Yep. Yep. Yeah, we're making changes in the body to be better prepared and better equipped to deal with the stresses that heat put on the body. And so, Ricky, maybe you can get into like what happens to the body when we're exercising in hot conditions.
Yeah, for sure. So like I think like one of the basic principles in a lot of exercise is metabolic rate. It's your body, basically breaking down carbohydrates, fats as fuel, creating ATP. But like basically, metabolic rate is creating heat. I feel like I've heard, just before that, people that have a fast metabolism run really hot. And I think there's something to that. As your metabolic rate increases, your core temperature increases. And I think core temperature is going to be a big theme of this podcast. And I think it's something that in the endurance sports world is becoming kind of like that new, I don't want to say buzzword, but it's something that's super important. So as your metabolic rate increases, your core temp increases, and the heat is going to basically increase that metabolic rate. And so thus, increase core temp. Obviously dehydration is going to be a big thing. Sweating is, and we'll get more into this, sweating is your body's main kind of mechanism of cooling it down. And blood volume and blood plasma, we'll get into that. That is something that's basically helping your body cope with this. And I think one of the big things that can happen is like cellular damage. We've heard of things like heat stroke. At a cellular level, like heat is damaging your body, and your brain is sending signals to protect it. So if you've ever just like been out in the heat and you just feel like complete crap and you don't know why, it's because your body is like, dude, you're ruining me here. I need to slow you down. So I think that's why we'll see a lot of times a decrease in performance. And because of that, we're trying to figure out methods to have our bodies kind of cope with it. So Andrew, do you want to like talk a little bit about core temp, like get more into kind of, what is that tipping point of core temperature?
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, I don't actually have an exact number of a core temp at which um, your body's performance decreases. But here's the good news: is that as you were kind of explaining to our listeners, the biggest indication that performance is decreased in these hot conditions is RPE. So this is like a really practical method of understanding how you're dealing with heat. So different people are going to dissipate heat better or worse depending on morphology and metabolic rate, as you said, as well as your fitness level even. So,
Mm-hmm.
higher fitness level means already more plasma volume, which is one of the adaptations we're going to talk about here. Um, but one thing, or maybe another way to kind of talk about this is like what is considered hot conditions. And so,
Yeah.
through reading the studies, most of them draw the line at around 77 degrees Fahrenheit or 25 degrees Celsius. That's the temperature above which your performance will decrease if you're not acclimated. And again, you are going to experience this, and your body is telling you you need to chill out because we are accumulating heat and our core temperature is going up, in some cases to an unsafe level. So, when it's really hot, this is not one of those times where you push through the pain, because what your body is telling you is, as you said, you could be doing cellular damage. You could be um, undergoing heat related illness. And so this is something we want to be really, really careful about. But getting back to the core temp question, um, we can talk a little bit about the impulse or the mechanism of adaptation for heat acclimation. And so um, elevated core temp is the primary um, stimulus for adaptation, and the secondary one, or the one that's maybe even sort of more noticeable, is increased skin blood flow and sweat production. And so what this looks like practically is you're sweating a lot. So if you're sweating a lot, you are adapting to the heat.
Yeah, some people think it's a bad thing. They're like, oh, I just like I get outside and I just start sweating right away. Like, even Joe Schmo is like walking outside and he starts sweating right away. But that might mean he's like actually heat adapted, like better than I am.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. And so, going back to the core temp question, um, is there um, an ideal core temp that you found um, to try and induce heat adaptation, or like what are we targeting? What is the goal, and how do we know that we're hot enough to make these adaptations happen?
Yeah, like I guess this is like a good segue of actually getting into like what heat adaptation is. And so basically kind of like we explained before, it's like we're essentially trying to get the body's core temperature to a point, which is actually interestingly like a very fine window of like, where you want your core temp. It's like, I guess like Frank would say the Goldilocks principle. There's like not quite enough, there's too much, and then there's just right. So like I think that gold kind of standard is 38.5 degrees Celsius is where we are starting to make adaptations in the body. And from what I've kind of seen, that like 38.5 to maybe 39.5 degrees Celsius is like the range at which we want to work. And once you get to 40.5 degrees Celsius, like at that point we're already kind of doing too much. And so it is this kind of fine balance of getting your core temp to a certain level and not doing too much. And most of us, it's not like we're out there with sensors all over our bodies, figuring this out. But we're gonna go into kind of how you can figure out exactly, where your core temp is, or kind of guess. But during heat adaptation, we're getting our core temp up, and the main things that are happening is blood plasma volume is going up, and I think that's probably one of the biggest things. Sweat rate onset is increasing. So, like, once you start sweating, how much you sweat, and even your sweat composition will change. I mean, we talked about the salty jersey. You might be a really salty sweater, and your body can change that composition, and you can basically lose less salt and sweat more. That's the goal. Is like we want you to sweat a ton, but we don't want to lose. We don't want to lose like all that sodium in there. Resting, exercise core temp goes down, and better thermal tolerance and regulation. Plasma volume, I guess that's probably one of the big things here. Like, Andrew, take us through a little bit about plasma volume and what it's doing, and what increasing it is actually going to do.
Yeah, so there's one of the cool things about plasma volume expansion is that not only is it going to help our performance in the heat, but it's going to help our performance in general, at least to some degree. So when we increase our plasma volume, the effect that happens is something called hemodilution, basically meaning that like our blood becomes like a little bit thinner, which is going to allow us to basically send more blood flow to to your skin, which is going to allow you to cool off better without shunting it all away from the working muscles. So it's sort of like we're increasing plasma volume, so we have more blood to handle more areas. Whereas when we're not heat adapted, we have this lower plasma volume. You know, so much of the blood that we need to deliver oxygen to our working muscles is just going away from there, and it's going to the skin to cool us off. Um, so having this increased plasma volume is going to help us cope with the heat better, but it can also increase our VO2 max, and that's even going to be in cool conditions. And this happens by way of like an increase in stroke volume, which is the amount of blood that your heart can pump, right?
Yeah.
So we see big performance increases in hot conditions, but we're also going to maybe even see some performance increases in cool conditions, and it does depend how much this helps us and how much that plasma volume expands depends on one's fitness level, because increasing your fitness is also going to increase plasma volume. So,
mhm.
it's an adaptation that we see from exercise in general, but with heat exposure, we can increase it further.
And there could even be some like kind of cross benefits. I've definitely, used heat like as a protocol to help athletes like cope with altitude before. So I mean, I think the increase in blood plasma volume, like the cardiovascular benefits that we're getting here, it's multi-purpose. And I mean, I guess the main thing of like why we're even doing heat adaptation is just like RPE. Like you said, it's such a kind of basic fundamental principle of training, but we don't think about it that much. But just it's almost like that RPE kind of links into the mental barrier that we kind of face when it's hot outside. You just feel like complete crap. So if you can delay, that onset of feeling totally terrible, like that's huge.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, you had mentioned better thermal tolerance and regulation. In part of the mechanism there, or one of the adaptations there, is these heat shock proteins, which we won't get too deep into because it becomes very technical and honestly a bit above my pay grade. But I pulled a good quote from a study that just sort of resonated with me and made a lot of sense. And it said, by stimulating heat shock protein production, we're able to enable greater cell protection against the adverse effects of high temperature. So,
Mm-hmm.
one thing you mentioned is, when we become better adapted to the heat, and this is something that we can use in the absence of like a core body temp sensor to kind of measure how our adaptation is going, is that you just become more comfortable in the heat, right?
Yeah.
The RP goes down for a given effort in hot conditions, and it's cool because this represents what's happening physiologically. So it's not just sort of like a perceptual benefit, but it's a real physical benefit. And that physical benefit is that your cells, um, after these repeated heat exposures, are going to be better able to cope with this heat stress. And so the risk of heat related illness is actually going down. So your body is giving you the right signals.
Yeah.
It's telling
Yeah.
you,
I mean,
yeah, this
we're
is fine.
basically, yeah, we're basically like protecting your body from getting heat stroke, which is like a real thing. And I think I actually don't have like a study on this, but my assumption would be the older you get, the probably the higher risk you have of heat related illness. But I mean, I think everyone is probably susceptible to it,
Totally.
and I've definitely had those moments, like especially some of those like Toad Tour of America's Dairyland crits after where I'm like dizzy, I'm shivering, all these signals that like my body is like, yo, man, you're not in good shape right now. Like if maybe I had done some heat acclimation work, maybe I can delay that or, just kind of get rid of it entirely. So I think it's definitely, we're saying that you might not, we're all about performance, 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 but you can't perform if you're having heat stroke out there. So I think
Totally.
the protection against that is massive.
Yeah.
So yeah,
And
go ahead.
beyond just like the risk of like heat related illness, specifically talking about like cellular damage, for example, there's also obviously a big risk of dehydration. I mean, this can happen
Yeah.
in cool temps if you're sweating a lot and you're not taking in enough sodium. And that's one of the other big adaptations that you've already mentioned, is that your body is retaining more water. We're sweating more, but also losing less sodium, which means
Hmm.
that we're going to be less likely to become dehydrated, which is, as all of our listeners probably know, also a main uh, driver of poor performance, dehydration.
Yeah.
Another cool thing that happens is that as your body becomes better heat adapted, our thirst signals become sort of more accurate. So our body learns to um, like more accurately drink the correct amount that it
Hmm.
needs. So
Interesting.
when we first start exercising in the heat, for whatever reason, um, our natural thirst signals are kind of out of whack. So that's another cool kind of like psychological or like practical
Hmm.
adaptation that happens. Um,
Interesting. Let's let's get more into like methods here. I think kind of when we're talking about heat acclimation, like the two big kind of things we have are passive and active. Like let's start with passive. Passive, basically is the sauna, the hot bath, these super hot conditions that we can't really experience just out on the bike that almost are like a expedited method of heat acclimation because of this extreme heat. And I think, us as coaches, I think we've probably done a few different protocols with saunas and hot baths and kind of seeing what's right. So like let's talk about sauna, let's talk about hot bath. I mean, do you have a preference between the two? Like have you found one works better? Like what are the kind of methods with those?
yeah, yeah. That's a good question. And like before I get into like what my preferred uh, method of passive heat acclimation is, I want to start off by just kind of piggybacking on something that you said. The reason we're able to sort of expedite heat acclimation, and I think what Ricky means by this is that we can we can spend less time um, in a sauna or a hot bath and get the same acclimation as spending more time, let's say, doing the active methods, which we'll get into in a second, which include overdressing or just exercising in really hot conditions. And the reason we can do this, or the reason why it's sort of expedited, is because it's hotter than it ever would be outside. And what that does is it gets our core body temperature to that magic kind of Goldilocks 38.5 degrees quicker, right? Um, and the reason we're able to deal with that is because we're just sitting there,
Yeah.
right?
Just
If you feel,
suffering.
yeah, you're just suffering. And so there's this, as we already established, this sort of like inverse relationship between performance or the intensity that we can exercise at or the duration that we can exercise at in that temperature. So like the name of the game with heat acclimation is like getting up to that core body temperature quickly and then staying there for, let's say, 20 or 30 minutes at a time. And so those are sort of some of the numbers with these passive protocols. And in terms of like my preference, I love the sauna.
Yeah.
I enjoy it more, which I think is like a big kind of practical piece of all this is, um, this is something that you're going to have to do like multiple times a week for a couple weeks at least. And so if you can kind of enjoy whatever method you choose, you're going to be more likely to do it and you're going to come out the other end less cracked. Um, I like it too because some research has indicated that we can get away with a little bit less time in the sauna than in a hot bath. Um, and another practical consideration, and this comes from a lot of experience trying both methods and having athletes of mine try both methods, is that when you get in a hot bath, I find that it's a little bit harder to um, keep track of how hot you're getting, right? Like you don't feel yourself sweating in the same way
Yeah,
that
you don't sweat.
sauna.
You are sweating, but you
You are
just don't
sweating.
realize it.
You're just sweating into the water that you're sitting in. And so,
And I think to give people like a little bit more insight, like to the hot bath. I mean, like we're talking like a hot tub here, and we're talking about pretty hot water. I mean, we're talking about 104-degree water, and you're pretty much up to your head. Almost basically neck down is completely submerged. And I will tell you, it's absolutely awful. I mean, the sauna is awful too, but I honestly think that the hot tub is particularly terrible.
yeah. So do you agree with me then, Ricky, that the preferred method of passive adaptation is the sauna?
I think so. I think, and we'll get into the practicality of it. I think some people just might have a hot tub, and then it's like awesome. Why get a gym membership that has a sauna if you have the hot tub? It might be practical there, but if it then comes down to you having to sit in your bathtub and keep filling it with hot water, that might not be the most fun. Or kind of like you said, like I enjoy to a level the suffering that the sauna provides, and it makes you feel like you're doing something, where the hot tub, you just feel like you're like boiling chicken inside there.
Yeah, yeah. And so there's, with what we're saying here, I just want to point out to all of our listeners that there is a very definite um, risk with the hot water immersion method. So you're at home alone. Everybody has a bathtub at home. Not maybe they don't, but many people have a bathtub at home. You're sitting in this super hot bath. You're conjuring up this image Ricky described of boiling a chicken. Um, you really need somebody almost there to make sure you're not getting too hot. And when you get out, if you experience lightheadedness or any of these kind of classic signs of heat related illness, it, that's not a good
Done
sign.
too
That's a sign
much.
that you've gone too far. So if our listeners are going to try this method, I would urge them to be super careful. Um,
I mean, I think
but
any of these methods, it goes without saying. It's like the sauna too. I think there is always risk related to these methods, and I think there is some level where it's like you do have to build a little bit of tolerance. We'll talk about the exact kind of dosage, but yeah, you can't just go in the sauna for an hour and be like, well, I'm just going to get all this adaptation out of the way in 3 days. It's like, no, you'll die doing that. So like, you really have to be careful, and you have to listen to your body during these,
yeah,
because the worst thing you could do is ultimately just fry yourself up. And that again
right.
is something we'll definitely get into. But I think it's like worth also saying that sauna, like temperature wise, 80 degrees to 100 degrees Celsius, that's 176 to 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Like, that's hot. That's very hot. So, again, we're like trying to be precise here and always kind of err maybe on the side of being conservative with some of these approaches.
Yeah, yeah. And so, Ricky, if you were doing passive methods alone, so either the hot bath or the hot sauna, how much um, how much per day do we need to expose ourselves to sort of maximize adaptation?
Yeah. So, you'll get 5 different studies saying 5 different things. But there does seem to be like a general consensus that you do a lot of times want to work somewhat closely to the event at which you're trying to basically be acclimated for. And so I think maybe this isn't going to be my exact preferred method, but I think this is one that you'll see pretty commonly is 10 to 21 days out from the event, exposure somewhere in the way of 3 to 4 times per week. Ranging from 20 to 30 minutes. And I think 30 minutes a lot of times is probably that upper limit. And so, in a 3 week span, you might be going somewhere in the way of 12 to 15 times. And I think what we've both kind of agreed on, and a lot of these studies kind of will argue, is that more is better. But I also think there's something to be said that you have to make sure that you are not overly fatiguing yourself during this process, because a lot of times in those 3 weeks leading up to, let's assume it's an A event, you might have a taper that is somewhere from 10 to 14 days, which is going to require rest. It's also going to require hard work. So it's like anything else, heat adaptation is a stress. Just like riding, it is a stress on the body, and too much of a stress is not a good thing. And if we are adding this on top of the riding that you have to do, um, you can honestly overly fatigue yourself, and then you're really not getting most out of this. And I think we don't want to be sacrificing the quality of the work that you do on the bike in the days after the sauna, just for heat acclimation. Because again, if you're losing fitness throughout this, or you're creating more fatigue than your body can handle, then it doesn't even matter if you're heat adapted, because you're going to show up to the race fried. So there are other methods as well that actually take place earlier than that kind of 2 to 3 week window. And we talked a little bit about this before, is that actually starting farther out can actually be beneficial because you can do a bulk of the adaptation and then you can do kind of like what we call a maintenance phase. So like your body is not going to lose its heat acclimation in a day or 2 days or three. Like usually I think it's like it'll last a week, before you start to see decline. It's not gone, but like after a week you'll start to see decline. So there are other methods where basically you are doing a bulk of that, let's just call heat adaptation, sauna, hot bath volume, like somewhere in 6 weeks out. And you're doing maybe 3 weeks where you're doing a protocol of 3 to 4, sometimes maybe even 5 days per week. And then you're doing maintenance basically after those 3 weeks where you're doing maybe every 3 days you're doing a session. And that's basically just holding that kind of heat adaptation at a certain level. And then once you get a week, 10 days out from your event, you up that dose slightly, maybe by 1 day. And so you're increasing that heat adaptation a little bit. But basically, yeah, we're almost doing like a bulk of it ahead of time. And I do know there's people too that will do it farther out than that to just create a level, maybe a lower baseline, almost like that kind of base fitness level of heat adaptation. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big practical takeaway from what you're saying, Ricky, is that um, heat stress is stress, and it goes in sort of the same bucket as our riding stress. Obviously, we don't have like a TSS value from these heat sessions, but I think what's most important here is that you are budgeting your energy and the training load that you have um, to optimize this protocol, right? And so I think the timing is really important, as you indicated. So you have to think a lot about like where are you in your training cycle, right?
Yeah,
If I'm
yeah,
doing like maybe 6 weeks out is when I'm doing like a VO2 max build, right? That's going
yeah.
to be an extremely high stress um, moment in my periodization. So maybe when I'm there, I'm not doing this heat acclimation protocol, or I'm doing it in a really sort of minimal way where it's having um, not a huge impact on my ability to recover and cope with the stress of that block. Um, or maybe this is reversed, right? And some of your more critical training sessions are happening, right before that event. The other takeaway is that just like our training on the bike, we ideally want to taper this heat acclimation protocol. So in that week leading up to the race, maybe we're backing off. Maybe originally we were doing 3, 4, 5 days a week of heat exposure sessions, and then we taper that to, maybe just 3 or 4 to maintain. And I actually have some stats or just some quotes on like the decay. So
Okay.
what's required for maintenance um, is at least some exposure every few days seems to be kind of the minimum level to maintain. And so another quote is full heat acclimation is lost within a month. Um, but even after 2 weeks without heat exposure, um, end exercise heart rate, sweat rate, um, core temp can be expected to decay by the numbers are 35, 30, and 6% respectively. So another piece of this, and this gives credence to Ricky's concept of a longer protocol being better, is that the shorter the heat acclimation protocol, the faster the decay rate.
Hmm.
So if you bust your butt and you try and acclimate as much as you can in 1 week, that's going to go away a lot quicker than if you spent 5 or 6 weeks. So in other words, we get more durable adaptations from a longer protocol, and it's going to require a little bit less to sort of maintain that. Um,
Just kind of like a base fitness, I think for like the
yeah,
listeners
yeah,
out there, like trying to decipher some of this, it's like that aerobic base basically, or that sweet spot kind of, base plan that you're doing that's allowing you to then kind of do the maintenance, the sharpening pieces later on. You have this level that's going to last. And
yeah,
I think there's something to be said too, like the periodization, even within the weeks of when you're doing it. And I think this is the benefit of having a coach because they can kind of create your plan and build this heat adaptation within it. So like for instance, let's say that I have an athlete that has Monday and Fridays as a rest day, Tuesdays and Wednesdays an intensity session, Thursday is an endurance day, and then endurance on the weekends. I think a lot of times it's good to build those heat sessions into days that are not followed by a massive workout or something super intense. So maybe you do it knowing that the next day is going to be an endurance day, or that the next day is going to be a recovery day. There's two sides to that though. Also, if you have a very intense session but an easy day the next day and you do a sauna protocol on top of that, you might be blunting, adaptations because of the lack of rest that you're getting. So I think you have to be really careful at how you structure it within your plan and basically make sure, like, is this going to just cause more fatigue? Like I would never recommend an athlete just does it on a recovery day. Like I like to keep
Mhm.
recovery for recovery. So like I think there is a time and place, maybe during a less intense part of the season when you could do that. But I think it's worth saying that, like, think about when you're going to do this and make sure you have adequate time to recover.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And so that also, there's another benefit of keeping our hard days hard and our easy days easy, which is, um, if you're going to follow a passive protocol, meaning the hot water immersion or the hot sauna session, the best way to do that, and the timing of that is that you go straight from your
Mm-hmm.
hard ride, your hard interval session, straight into the sauna or straight
Yeah.
into your hot bath.
Because
And
dehydration actually plays into this. Like, I'm sure you can talk a little bit about this. Like, dehydration, there's like a signal that the body's picking up from that. So, like, touch on
yeah.
that.
Yeah, so this was something I did a good bit of research on because it is something that I had heard before, and I'm glad you brought it up. So, the way that they phrased it in the studies was permissive dehydration, sort of meaning that
Mm-hmm.
it's sort of intentional. And so dehydration has been known to be a signal on its own for plasma volume expansion.
Mm-hmm.
But lucky for all of our listeners, what, what the study I read found out was that, as long as the heat stress was matched, dehydration, permissive dehydration, and hypohydration, meaning like that you're a little bit
Underhydrating.
dehydrated,
Yeah.
it did not positively affect heat acclimation. So this is just to say, like, we have to kind of dispel this, and basically, it's not going to help us beyond uh, what we're already doing, exposing ourselves to heat. So the recommendation is just drink ad libitum, which just means you know drink as you're thirsty. And we had talked
Mm-hmm.
earlier about how your body is actually becoming better calibrated to it's sending the correct thirst signals. So trust that, rehydrate. But kind of the critical piece here is that, um, when thermal strain is matched, it's equal, right? So if you're drinking freezing cold water, ice water, when you're in the sauna, and you're
Yeah.
effectively lowering your core temperature,
Yeah.
uh, that's not equal. That's hurting you.
Gym,
So
gym bro with a gallon of water in
yeah.
there, just like, yeah.
So maybe, and this isn't something I found in the studies, but just kind of a practical thought. Rehydrate. Ad libitum, as we said, just to thirst. But maybe don't do freezing cold water, right?
Yeah.
Because that's going to lessen your core body temperature, and that is gonna get in the way of adaptation. So if you are gonna drink when you're in your hot bath or in your sauna, maybe just drink sort of like tepid water.
Yeah.
um,
And I think there's something to be said too. There's like studies that, recommend like hyperhydration after or at a certain point, because I mean, you are losing a ton of water and like you're going to be losing blood volume like along with that. And to increase this blood volume, like there has to be a level of hyperhydration. So I think on a lot of these days, like you probably are going to be drinking more than you normally would. I don't want to get, I think it probably depends on size of the person, but like, um, I would think multiple liters probably throughout the day. You're not just
yeah.
slamming it after, but I think you're probably maintaining a higher level of hydration than you
Yeah.
normally would, especially on these days.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to salt your food either, right? That's
Yeah.
like another kind of easy sort of practical thing to do. But um, before we move on to active methods, Ricky, I just wanted to kind of touch on one last thing about sort of um, how we're implementing the passive protocol. Um, and I think again, I like what you were saying about keeping our hard days hard. And I think the reason why this works particularly well for the purposes of, our heat acclimation and getting the most out of it is that when we finish a hard interval session, or even, like a longer endurance day, we finish our ride with a higher core body temp,
Hmm.
right? So we're already well on our way to being at this sort of like optimal temperature for adaptation. And so the way that we implement our sauna or our hot water immersion is directly after these hard sessions, right?
Yeah.
We want to minimize the time between riding and getting in that sauna, which I know if you don't have a sauna at home, this could be like a practical challenge for you, right? You have to get yourself to a gym that has a sauna, or maybe have your significant other like you know,
Yeah.
putting a hot bath on for you, so that you're ready to just hop right in afterwards. Yeah, and you just spend 30 minutes in there, and boom, you're done. We've sort of
Awesome.
optimized things.
Yeah.
Versus, as Ricky said, like this isn't going to work as well if it's a recovery day. You've done your
Hmm.
easy spin. Exercise intensity induces higher core temp. And what we know about easy days is that the intensity is low, right,
Yeah.
everyone? Yeah.
Keep it low.
Keep it low, easy. And also, as Ricky said, I think practically speaking, keeping your easy days easy is a good way to ensure that we're not going to overdo it, right? We're
Exactly.
minimizing total stress on those days. So both riding stress and heat stress.
Yeah.
And one last piece of this that I'll mention is, once you're done with your heat exposure for the day, don't sit in your car in traffic with the AC off. Don't set your bedroom temp at 75 degrees. This is not going to help. Not only is it not enough heat, but what the research indicates is that um, more exposure above like a certain time frame isn't helpful, right? So doing like 2 or 3 times a day in the sauna isn't better than one time a day in sauna. So do the protocol correctly. Like consolidate that heat exposure, and then be done with it and focus on recovery. You don't need to be hot all the time. So this is not sort of like altitude in that
Yeah.
regard.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Good point. I mean, on the flip side, low core temp equals good sleep. Good sleep equals good recovery, and that's how you get faster. So okay, let's move on to active. I feel like active is actually, and it sounds funny because it's actually pretty basic when we get down to it, but active is something that now I think is becoming more popular. And I think, it's worth saying that these are two different methods that work for some people and don't work for others. Like myself, for instance, like I have found that the sauna fries me up. And I've done it years and I've done different methods and I've done tons of things, but I have found that it's not the right method for me. And also from a practicality standpoint, active can be easy. Active is basically we are trying to get that core body temperature to that 38.5 degrees Celsius, but we are doing it on the bike. We are doing it by method of either overdressing or simply, I mean, you could be riding in, you could be in Texas and it's like 100 degrees outside and you're ultimately going to get your core body temperature up. So, but what we can do is we can prescribe active heat acclimation sessions. And what that might look like is something, and again, I think the main takeaway is we are never sacrificing the quality of the riding that we are doing. Like, if anything, the quality of the riding, the intervals, the intensity, like that takes precedent over heat acclimation. So, what a lot of times we will do is we will add like a supplemental portion of the ride dedicated to the heat adaptation. And it is maybe after we've done intervals, maybe it is the last 30 minutes to an hour of a ride. But what that might look like is I will tell an athlete, like, okay, you've got, a 2.5 hour ride, you've got 3x20 tempo in there. And then for the last 30 minutes, I want you to put on a winter jacket, winter gloves, hat, leg warmers, like whatever you would ride in 30-degree weather. I want you to do that when it's like 80 degrees outside. That's like one method that we can do. There's downfalls to it. And then, so there's a second thing we can do is if you're riding the trainer, it's actually a lot easier to achieve this. Like we all know what it feels like to ride without the fan on a trainer. So last 30 minutes of a ride, or even, you get done with an outdoor ride, you hop on the trainer, 30 minutes, can even be sometimes up to an hour of riding with no fan, maybe a jacket on. Basically what we're trying to do is get your body to that core temp. And we're doing it while we're riding. It's a different methodology, and there's things that can make it difficult being outside. Like wind is always going to be something that is going to like cool you down a bit. But yeah, it's just another method we can do it. Andrew, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I want to like impress upon our listeners is that basically, for this to be working, or the way that you know that you're hot enough, is that you're sweating profusely. That's how
Yeah.
you know, right? Like if you just feel kind of hot and you're outside, this is not enough stress to optimize adaptations. If you're just riding outside, just doing your normal thing, and it's like, let's say 80 to 85 degrees, this is going to help to some degree, but it's just not going to optimize the level of adaptation that we're going to get. So that's, I think, an important thing to remember. So all of the Garmin users out there will know that if you do these, rides in relatively hot conditions, your Garmin at the end of your ride will tell you your percent of heat acclimation. It, this isn't fully accurate, right? It doesn't have a way of knowing what your core body temperature is, and so I tried to do a little bit of research, and what I found is, if it's above 77 degrees, which I like that Garmin agrees with our threshold number there, our threshold temperature, in that the way that it knows what the temperature is it's just pulling GPS data to get that number. Then
So
it'll
it's not
it'll give
doing the
you
classic
some.
like ambient heat off the ground when it says it's like 106 degrees outside.
No, yeah. So that does tell us something, right? And we do get acclimated by riding in relatively hot conditions. But what we're talking about here is we're talking about optimizing these adaptations, optimizing our level of acclimation to be the best prepared. And like Ricky said, you got to be really hot. And we're separating this from the quality work, right? So we're doing the quality first to minimize what we'll call the interference effect. And then, our core temperature is already raised, and then we're putting the jacket on, we're putting the gloves and the hat on, and we're finishing with that heat exposure. So it's basically the same protocol that we talked about with the passive heat acclimation methods, where we're doing this at the end of a session, and we're kind of, we're doing this on our hard days. We're not doing it on our easy days. We're keeping our easy days easy. Um, but yeah, I think those are kind of my only thoughts.
I
I
think
think
it's worth mentioning too. There is some cool, like for like our tech nerds out there, there is some really cool stuff that's coming out that is becoming more popular. I think the core temp sensor. I think the brand is just called Core
core.
Temp. It's just called Core, and basically what it is it's an add-on that you basically put onto your heart rate strap, and it has an algorithm from skin temperature that can figure out core temperature. And I know we wanted to talk about this. They have verified it with rectal thermal temperature probes,
Thermometry.
thermometry. It has been verified.
Thermometry.
So I think there's a level of accuracy. I don't think anything is perfect, but basically, like almost similar to power, this core temp breaks your core temperature into zones. It's like zone 1 through 4, where it's like high zone 2, zone 3 is this kind of 38.5 to 39.5 degree range. And then zone 4 is kind of that exceeding 40.5 degrees Celsius. And what the sensor is doing is it's just recording data and seeing how much time you are spending above that core temperature. So what you could effectively do is during these active sessions, I think it is compatible with Wahoo and Garmin, and you can actually display it on your screen and see your core temp. You can more objectively show that you are at that core temp, and then you can hold it there. Because I think the key is like, we don't want you waving in and out. It's like, we don't want you doing 1 minute at 38.5 and then letting yourself cool down. We want a sustained level of core temperature above 38.5. And I think this core temp is kind of cool. Again, it's money, it's another
Mhm.
thing for maybe your significant other to be like, no freaking way, you can't buy that. And we will kind of tell you maybe some more practical, cheaper ways of telling it. But Andrew, do you have thoughts on the core temp sensor?
Uh, yeah, I mean, it seems great. I think like the more precise we can be about this, the better, because we don't want to go overboard with this. Um, but but before we sort of moved on to talking about uh, which methods we each prefer,
Yeah.
one thing I wanted to say about the active protocol is one of the big benefits of doing that versus the passive protocol um, is that it's important that we are experiencing what we're going to experience on race day,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? So both from like an adaptation perspective, there's probably some specificity of adaptations that happen when we more closely replicate the conditions we're actually going to be racing in. But there's some major sort of um, perceptual or like mental benefits, right? Like we want to know what it feels like, and it's also like um, when we're actually exercising in the heat, when we're following the active protocol, um, we get to feel that RPE coming down. We get to
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
build comfort, but even with building comfort, even if you're really adapted, um, there's still a limit, right? And we need to kind of learn where that kind of red line is. We'll say like where the you know 10,000 RPMs on your tachometer is, right?
Yeah.
Because on race day, when it's super, super hot, we're still going to have to apply some pacing. It's just like at altitude, right? Even if
Mm-hmm.
you're acclimated to a given altitude, the power output is still going to be lower, right? So you
Yeah.
have to recalibrate, you have to adjust your pacing targets. And so we want to learn to do this. And so, I recommend for the active method, um, the closer you can be to replicating the conditions you're actually going to be racing in, I would say the better, right? So this
Yeah.
is, maybe goes beyond practicality, um, but getting really used to exercising in super dry heat is going to be different than getting really used to exercising in super humid heat because it just feels different. It feels different. The
Yeah.
sensations are different. Maybe even at like a very small level, the adaptations can be a little bit different
Well,
because
in
there's obviously
humidity, we have no evaporative cooling. It's like that's
right,
the
right,
classic thing of being like, oh, it's a wet, humid heat. It's like, yeah, because basically when you have that humidity, you have no evaporative cooling. You're pretty much wet all the time, opposed to a dry, boulder heat where you might not even, the sweat is basically evaporating right away. But what's happening is it is still cooling your skin, like when
right.
that is happening. So I think it's definitely important that, like what you're saying, it's like to replicate those conditions. And maybe you won't have that ability to do that, but the closer you can get, the better. That's like always what we're striving for.
Yeah, yeah, and so I think this is actually a really good segue to sort of talking about, you know, what I recommend, what you recommend, what we've experienced ourselves, and sort of like what our protocols would be. Like, is there a better method? How do we do it, etc. And so, um, I think my preferred method, what's worked best for me, what I like best, and this dovetails really nicely with everything we just said, is I actually like starting with passive heat. We start with sauna. I think the protocol that I'd recommend for most people is you start 3 weeks out. I think 3 weeks is a good kind of timeline to sort of maximize adaptation and also give us a little bit of space to periodize this in a smart way. And so maybe for the first week, and we want to do this on consecutive days, maybe let's say our Tuesday through Thursday where we're doing uh, endurance days or intervals. You finish those rides, you get in the sauna for 30 minutes, and we begin this adaptive process. Once we've developed some adaptation to the heat, then we transition to start to integrate the active method into our protocol. So let's say on week 2 or even over that first weekend, we've already got some adaptation going. Then we're following the active method. And as we become better adapted, the more we can integrate the active method of overdressing or exercising the hottest part of the day into our training without sacrificing the quality as much. Because the better adapted we are, the less risk of heat related illness, and the higher the intensity and duration we'll be able to achieve. And we progress this to be increasingly specific up until maybe, let's say, 1 week out. So what I would really like to see, for myself or for my athletes, is that after that kind of 2 week period is about up, we've done at least one ride in temperatures that are going to be about what we're going to be racing in, and we're doing it with the same duration and intensity. So we're being as specific as possible, and so this is both so that you can have those you know pacing lessons, and also so you just can develop a certain comfort with that, but also as sort of just like proof that the protocol worked. So we're doing both, and that's what the studies indicate as well, is that like multiple induction methods is optimal. And that 2 week timeline seems to be like a just kind of a sweet spot, right?
Yeah.
It's fairly practical. We have enough time to do some level of periodization with this. And the other piece of this is that kind of in those initial 2 weeks, we want to, as much as possible, you know, do these heat exposures on consecutive days. We see better results from that. So maybe that means 5 days a week of heat exposure, if possible, is going to be better than 3 days. But I do agree with Ricky that we want to keep our easy days easy. So we're not doing 7 days, we're doing 5 days, right? We're still taking those 2 rest days. So that's what feels most both practical and optimal to me. What are your thoughts, Ricky?
I definitely agree with you. I actually really like what you said about almost doing a simulation in the conditions that the athlete will experience. And I had he's doing Les Tap, which is a 1 day event organized by the Tour de France organizers, where they do the Queen stage of the tour. And it's basically 3 2-hour climbs. It's insane. And so we wanted to, and it's coming up, and we wanted to do something that would simulate it. So I basically had him do this massive ride. He wound up doing it indoors. We did sections without a fan. And so I'm in agreement with you there. He crushed it, but it was also miserable. But no, I really think there are considerations, both practical and otherwise, for which method works best for you. I do think I think the sauna is a really good method if it works for you. I think, like we said, there can be some kind of expedition of the process of it. I'll play devil's advocate and say that I really now am becoming a bigger fan of the active method. And I think the trainer is a really controlled environment. I've found that a lot of times, even if it's pretty warm outside and you try to do it outside, that wind from riding will still cool you down to the point where basically you're getting the worst of both worlds. You're hot and you're sacrificing power and seeing a slight heart rate rise, but not enough. And so I think like one final thing that I can kind of touch on is when you're doing this active method and you don't have a core temp sensor. I think a way you can do it, other than, like Andrew said, sweating profusely is a pretty good indicator that your body is doing everything it can to cool down. But if you're looking at power and heart rate, and I think heart rate is actually almost going to be a more valuable tool in the heat than power can be, similar to altitude. But I think when we're doing these active methods, say you're doing 30 minutes on the trainer, no fan, with a jacket on at the end of a ride, what you will start to see is, and let's say you're also using RPE here, your RPE, you're trying to keep it on a given 7 out of 10, you will see that heart rate continue to rise, and you'll see an inverse relationship in power where it will decline at that given RPE. And so you might be at the point where your heart rate is pushing into threshold and your power is in low zone 2 and you feel like you are like dogging it out, that's a pretty good indicator that your body is at a pretty high core temperature. What exactly it is, we don't know, but I think if we're guessing, you just don't want to have it where you're seeing a bit of a heart rate increase and a bit of a power decline. You want to see a pretty strong inverse relationship of the two. So that's kind of, I think, where I stand on it now. Yeah, I think the active is become a pretty easy method to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's cheaper, right? You're not paying
For
for
sure.
a sauna or a sauna membership. There's none of the, or there's less risk than the hot water immersion method. You don't have to call your wife to draw you a bath before you get
Yeah.
home.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
practical in that regard. Um, One last thing I wanted to mention before we wrap up here, Rick, is this idea of cross acclimation. We've touched on this a little bit, but cross acclimation is when we're um, adapting using heat to altitude, right? So we're
Mm-hmm.
using this heat acclimation method so that we can be better in a different challenging condition, which is altitude, right? And so um, if this is going to work, the big thing that we need to happen is we want to see an increase in red blood cell volume. We want to see an increase in hemoglobin mass. And I did some research into whether or not this is something that happens alongside the plasma volume expansion that we already talked about. In it does, um, because at a certain level of hemodilution, which is a phrase we threw out earlier, just meaning that our hematocrit basically is going down, right? We increase plasma volume, but not
Mm-hmm.
proportional to red blood cell volume. This is actually going to stimulate uh, erythropoietin production from the kidneys to produce more red blood cells to keep things in balance.
Mm-hmm.
But this requires a longer protocol to happen. So, we can sort of maximize heat adaptation alone in 2 to 3 weeks. But to see these cross acclimation benefits and to get the increase in red blood cell volume, the research indicates that we need more like a 5 or 6 week protocol. So if you are trying to cross acclimate, or you just want the performance benefits of getting total blood volume up, which is going to help us more than plasma volume alone, you need to just budget for more time.
Yeah. Nice. Nice. Well, shoot, man, that was a good one. I think this might. I don't know. This could be the nerdiest Fast Cat podcast in a while, but I think I think there's some good tidbits in there that people can take out. So,
I think
I think
so.
though my final sage advice would just be, yeah, I mean, practicality and caution with all of this. Neither Andrew or I are PhD scientists. We're just merely interpreting the studies that we have out here. But I think as long as you're being cautious and conservative with some of these approaches, like these are things that are worth doing, and these are things that
Yeah.
are going to be massive in helping your performance. So,
Yeah.
thanks, man. That was a good one.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Ricky. Yeah.
All right.
How does Frank sign out on these? What do you say?
I can't remember. Maybe
Underneath,
we'll.
just follow the plan.
Yeah, consistency and follow the plan. Maybe Frank can add his own little something in there. But thank you, everybody. Thank you, Andrew. And we will see you guys next time.
Peace.